They put a white woman in a bathtub full of milk and told you that was Cleopatra. They gave her blue eyes and straight hair and a British accent, and you were supposed to believe that the most powerful woman in the ancient world just happened to look like she belonged in a London tea room. And you bought it. We all bought it because they put it in every movie, every painting, every textbook, every museum exhibit until the lie felt like common sense. But I need you to sit with something uncomfortable for a minute. Rome did not write about Cleopatra because she was beautiful. They wrote about her because she was terrifying. She made the two most powerful men in Roman history abandon their country, betray their people, and choose her over an empire. She came within inches of conquering Rome itself and ruling the entire Mediterranean world. And when Rome finally defeated her, they did not just kill her. They spent the next 2,000 years trying to kill the truth about who she actually was. Because Cleopatra was African. And if you knew that, you might start asking questions that powerful people have spent 20 centuries making sure you never ask. Let me tell you about the Cleopatra they built for you. In 1963, Hollywood released the most expensive movie ever made at that time. Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor, violet eyes, porcelain skin, the whitest woman they could find playing the Queen of Egypt. And that movie did not come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of centuries of European artwork showing Cleopatra as a pale-skinned seductress who just happened to rule an African country. They painted her white in the Renaissance. They sculpted her white in the neoclassical period. They put her in European gowns and gave her European features and surrounded her with European aesthetics until the African queen of an African nation looked like she had wandered out of a French palace. This was not an accident. This was not artists making innocent mistakes about what Egyptians looked like. This was a deliberate, sustained, multi-generational project to take one of the most powerful black women in human history and convince you she was white. Because the alternative was admitting that an African woman almost brought Rome to its knees. And that admission would crack the entire foundation of white supremacy wide open. You have to understand what Rome was building. They were not just building an empire. They were building an idea. The idea that civilization flowed from Europe outward. The idea that white people were natural rulers and everyone else was meant to be ruled. The idea that Africa was a dark continent full of savages who contributed nothing to human progress. This was the story Rome told about itself, and this was the story Europe inherited, and this was the story America imported. And this is the story you grew up swimming in like a fish that does not know it is wet. Cleopatra was a problem for that story. Because Cleopatra was not some primitive chief they conquered in a jungle. She was the ruler of one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. She spoke 9 languages. She was educated in mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and rhetoric. She commanded armies and navies. She controlled the grain supply that fed Rome itself. And she was African, ruling an African nation from an African city on the African continent. If they let you remember that, the whole narrative falls apart. So they could not let you remember it. They had to remake her in their image, strip away everything African about her, and present her as basically European so that her brilliance and power could be absorbed into the white supremacist story instead of contradicting it. Now here is where they try to get slick with you. They will tell you that Cleopatra was Greek, that she was a Ptolemy, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals who took over Egypt after Alexander died. And that is technically true. The Ptolemaic dynasty was founded by a Macedonian Greek named Ptolemy I. He was one of Alexander's companions, and when Alexander's empire fell apart after his death, Ptolemy grabbed Egypt and made himself pharaoh. So yes, Cleopatra's ancestor on one side was European, but here is what they do not tell you. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for 300 years before Cleopatra was born. 300 years. That is 15 generations of Ptolemaic rulers living in Africa, ruling African people, marrying into African families, producing children with African blood. They want you to believe that for 3 centuries, this Greek family kept itself completely pure, never mixing with the population they ruled, never taking Egyptian wives or concubines, never producing children with African mothers. That is not how royal dynasties work. That is not how human beings work. That is a fantasy designed to keep Cleopatra's bloodline as white as possible in your imagination. Let me tell you what we actually know about Cleopatra's family tree. We know who her father was, Ptolemy C. We have records of him. But her mother, we do not know. There is no historical record identifying Cleopatra's mother with certainty. The same is true for her grandmother and her great-grandmother. For 3 generations on the maternal side, the women who gave birth to the women who gave birth to Cleopatra are unidentified in the historical record. Now you might say that is just incomplete history. Records get lost. Maybe there were Greek women whose names just were not preserved. But think about what we are talking about here. These are the mothers of pharaohs, the women who gave birth to the rulers of one of the richest nations on earth. These were not peasants whose names nobody bothered to write down. If they were high-born Greek women from important families, we would know about them. Their lineage would be recorded because their lineage would matter politically. The fact that they are not recorded suggests something else entirely. It suggests that these women were not from families that the Greek historians wanted to acknowledge. It suggests that Cleopatra's maternal line included Egyptian women, African women, women whose bloodline would complicate the story the Ptolemies wanted to tell about themselves. The gap in the record is not an accident. It is a cover-up that is 2,000 years old. Let us talk about what the Romans and Greeks who actually saw Cleopatra wrote about her, because this is where it gets interesting. The Roman historian Plutarch wrote the most detailed ancient account of Cleopatra's life. And here is what Plutarch says about her appearance. He says her beauty was not the kind that would strike you immediately. It was not about her physical features. Her charm came from her conversation, her intelligence, the sweetness of her voice, and the way she could adapt to any situation. Now read that carefully. Plutarch does not say she was a stunning European beauty. He says her looks were not particularly remarkable, but her mind and personality were irresistible. That description makes a lot more sense if she looked African in a Roman world that considered African features less beautiful by their standards. If Cleopatra looked like Elizabeth Taylor, Plutarch would have said she was gorgeous. Instead, he is explaining why men fell in love with her despite her appearance not meeting Roman beauty standards. The Roman poet Lucan describes Cleopatra as having dark skin. The word he uses in Latin is associated with African complexions. Cassius Dio, another Roman historian, describes her as a woman of dark complexion. These are not modern interpretations. These are the actual words of people who lived within a few generations of Cleopatra, describing her as dark-skinned. But somehow, every European painting shows her as white. Somehow, every Hollywood movie casts white actresses. Somehow, the actual historical descriptions get ignored while the fantasy version gets promoted. But forget the written sources for a minute. Let us talk about the physical evidence. We have coins from Cleopatra's reign that show her face. These are not interpretations or copies or later reproductions. These are coins that were minted during her lifetime, approved by her government, bearing her official image. Look at those coins. Look at the nose. It is broad and prominent. Look at the lips. They are full. Look at the hair. It is thick and tightly curled. These are not European features. These are African features, stamped into metal while Cleopatra was still alive, circulated throughout her kingdom as the official representation of what the queen looked like. We also have statues and busts. Some of them are Roman copies made after her death, which are less reliable. But some date to her lifetime or close to it, and they show the same thing: a woman with African features ruling an African nation. The evidence is literally carved in stone and stamped in metal. You can go to museums and see it with your own eyes, but the caption next to the exhibit will still call her Greek, and the gift shop will still sell postcards showing her as white. And this brings me to something that should be obvious, but somehow needs to be said. Egypt is in Africa. I know that sounds ridiculous to even have to point out, but the way people talk about ancient Egypt, you would think it was a floating island in the Mediterranean that had nothing to do with the continent it sat on. Egypt is in Africa. It was always in Africa. The Nile River that made Egyptian civilization possible flows from the heart of the African continent. The people who built the pyramids and the Sphinx and the temples at Luxor were African people. For thousands of years before the Greeks or Romans ever showed up, Egypt was an African civilization built by African people with African knowledge and African labor. When the Ptolemies arrived, they did not find an empty land. They found one of the most advanced civilizations in human history already there, already thriving, already ancient. The Ptolemies did not create Egyptian greatness, they inherited it. They put on the clothes of pharaohs and worshipped Egyptian gods and adopted Egyptian customs because that was the only way to rule a country that had been African for 3,000 years before they arrived. Cleopatra was born in Africa. She ruled in Africa. She spoke the Egyptian language, the first Ptolemy in 300 years to bother learning it. She presented herself to her people as the goddess Isis, an African deity worshipped since before Greece was civilized. Whatever Greek blood she may have had was mixed with 3 centuries of African presence and African influence, and almost certainly African genetics. But they want you to think of Egypt as somehow separate from Africa so that they can claim Cleopatra as somehow separate from blackness. Now let me explain why Rome was so scared of this woman. It was not just that she was smart. Lots of rulers were smart. It was not just that she was rich. Egypt was wealthy, But Rome had conquered wealthy kingdoms before. It was not just that she was beautiful or seductive or any of the other nonsense they reduced her to. Rome was terrified of Cleopatra because she represented the possibility that an African power could dominate the Mediterranean. Think about the world in the 1st century BC. Rome was the rising superpower, but it was not yet the undisputed master of the known world. Egypt was still independent, still rich, still powerful. The grain that fed the Roman population came from Egyptian farms. If Egypt closed its ports, Rome starved. Cleopatra understood this leverage perfectly. She knew that whoever controlled Egypt controlled Rome's food supply. And she was not interested in being a client state or a vassal kingdom. She wanted Egypt to be Rome's equal, or better yet, Rome's master. An African queen ruling an African nation with ambitions to dominate the European power that thought it was destined to rule the world. That is what Rome was facing. And they knew that if she succeeded, everything they believed about themselves, about civilization, about who was meant to rule and who was meant to serve would be proven wrong. Julius Caesar falls. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC, he was already the most powerful man in the Roman world. He had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, defeated his enemies in a civil war, and declared himself dictator. He answered to no one. He feared no one. And Cleopatra played him like a violin. The famous story is that she had herself smuggled into his presence, rolled up in a carpet or a linen sack. She was 21 years old, fighting a civil war against her brother for control of Egypt. And she walked into a room with the most dangerous man alive and convinced him to fight her war for her. Within weeks, Caesar had abandoned his military objectives and was using Roman legions to put Cleopatra on the throne of Egypt. Within months, she was pregnant with his child. The dictator of Rome, the conqueror of nations, the man who had spent his entire life accumulating power, handed that power to a young African queen because she asked him to. And do not tell me this was just about sex. Caesar could have any woman he wanted. He had affairs all over the Roman world. Cleopatra was not special because she was pretty. She was special because she was brilliant, and she made Caesar believe that an alliance with her would make him greater than he already was. She saw his ambitions, and she positioned herself as the key to achieving them. By the time Caesar left Egypt, he was not the same man. He had fallen in love with a vision of a combined Roman-Egyptian empire with himself and Cleopatra as divine rulers. He brought her to Rome. He put a golden statue of her in the Temple of Venus, his family's patron goddess. He was so publicly devoted to her that it became one of the complaints against him when the Senate decided to kill him. They murdered Caesar on the Ides of March, and one of the reasons was that he had been seduced by an African queen into forgetting he was Roman. Before we go further, we need to talk about Caesarion. Cleopatra and Caesar had a son together. His name was Ptolemy Caesar, but everyone called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. He was the only biological son Julius Caesar ever had. Think about what that means. The most famous Roman in history, the man who transformed the Roman Republic into what would become the Roman Empire, had only one son, and that son was half African. Caesarion was raised in Egypt as the heir to both kingdoms. Cleopatra presented him to the Egyptian people as the son of the god Amun. If Caesar had lived and his plans had succeeded, Caesarion would have inherited both Rome and Egypt, uniting the two greatest powers in the Mediterranean under a single half-African ruler. The Roman establishment understood the threat. When they killed Caesar, they made sure to cut Caesarion out of any inheritance. Caesar's will named his grandnephew Octavian as his heir, not his actual biological son, because they could not allow the bloodline to continue. They could not allow a half-African boy to have any claim on Rome. And after Cleopatra died, one of the first things Octavian did was hunt down Caesarion and execute him. He was 17 years old, a teenager murdered because his existence proved that African blood could mingle with Roman blood at the highest level of power. They did not just want to defeat Cleopatra. They wanted to erase every trace of what her union with Caesar represented. After Caesar died, Cleopatra returned to Egypt and waited. She knew that Rome was about to tear itself apart in another civil war, and she knew that whoever won would need her. She was right. The winners were Octavian, Caesar's heir, and Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal general. They divided the Roman world between them, and Antony got the eastern half, which meant he had to deal with Cleopatra. They met at Tarsus in 41 BC, and Cleopatra put on a show that became legendary. She sailed up the river in a golden barge with purple sails and silver oars. She dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by children dressed as cupids, fanning her with ostrich feathers. The perfume from the ship was so strong that people on the shore could smell it before they could see it. Antony was supposed to summon her to answer questions about her loyalty during the recent civil war. Instead, she summoned him. She sent message after message, inviting him to dine with her on the barge. He came. Of course he came. Nobody said no to Cleopatra. Within months, Antony had abandoned his military campaigns and followed Cleopatra back to Egypt. He spent the winter in Alexandria, ignoring urgent dispatches from Rome, neglecting his duties, completely besotted with the queen. This was not a casual fling. This was a Roman general choosing an African queen over his own country. He eventually married her, even though he was already married to Octavian's sister. He gave Roman territory to her children. He declared Caesarion to be the true heir of Julius Caesar, directly challenging Octavian's legitimacy. Antony bet everything on Cleopatra. He threw away his Roman identity, his Roman alliances, and his Roman future because he believed that she was worth more than Rome. By 32 BC, war was inevitable. Octavian had spent years building public opinion against Antony and Cleopatra. He read Antony's will aloud in the Senate, which allegedly contained provisions to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome. He declared war, but technically he declared it against Cleopatra, not Antony, because Romans were not supposed to fight civil wars against each other. The real enemy, he wanted everyone to understand, was the African queen who had corrupted a Roman hero. The decisive battle came at Actium in Greece in 31 BC. Antony and Cleopatra had a combined fleet of about 500 ships and an army of over 100,000 men. On paper, they should have been able to fight Octavian to at least a stalemate. But the battle went wrong from the start. Antony's forces were weakened by disease and desertion. His ships were larger and slower than Octavian's. The battle turned into a disaster, and Cleopatra made the decision to break through the enemy line with her 60 ships and flee back to Egypt. Antony followed her. They left the bulk of their forces behind to be captured or killed. For 2,000 years, historians have debated why Cleopatra fled. Was she a coward? Was it a prearranged signal that Antony misunderstood? Was she trying to save the treasury she had loaded onto her ships? We will never know for sure. What we know is that Actium was the end. Cleopatra and Antony limped back to Egypt, knowing that Octavian was coming to finish them off. The dream of an African power dominating the Mediterranean died on that water. Octavian did not just defeat Cleopatra militarily, he destroyed her reputation systematically. This was the original cancel culture, and Octavian was a master at it. He understood that controlling the story was just as important as winning the war. Roman poets wrote vicious attacks on Cleopatra, calling her a drunk, a whore, a monster who had seduced good Roman men to their doom. They called her the Egyptian as an insult, emphasizing her foreignness, her otherness, her African identity. They portrayed her as everything Rome feared, a woman with power, an African with ambition, a queen who refused to kneel. Octavian commissioned artwork showing Cleopatra as a defeated enemy. He paraded her treasures through Rome in triumph. He spread stories about her decadence, her cruelty, her manipulation. Every negative stereotype about women, about Africans, about the East was dumped onto Cleopatra's image until she became a symbol of everything Roman virtue was supposed to oppose. And it worked. Octavian became Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and he lived long enough to make sure that his version of events became the only version that mattered. The historians who wrote about Cleopatra were writing under Augustus's rule. They knew what he wanted them to say. They knew that their careers and possibly their lives depended on telling the story the way the emperor wanted it told. Every ancient source we have about Cleopatra was written by her enemies or by people who lived under the rule of her enemies. We do not have a single Egyptian account, a single African perspective, a single word from anyone who might have been on her side. The history we inherited is Roman propaganda that got repeated so many times it started to feel like fact. You know the story of how Cleopatra died. Everyone knows this story. After Antony killed himself, believing falsely that she was already dead, Cleopatra locked herself in her mausoleum. Octavian wanted to take her alive so he could parade her through Rome as a trophy. She refused to give him the satisfaction. According to the legend, she smuggled a poisonous snake, an asp, into her chamber hidden in a basket of figs. She let the snake bite her and died peacefully, cheating Octavian of his triumph. It is a dramatic story. It is a romantic story. It is probably not true. Ancient sources themselves admitted they were not sure how Cleopatra died. Plutarch says no asp was ever found. The bite marks were never confirmed. Some sources suggest she used poison hidden in a hairpin. Others suggest Octavian might have had her killed and invented the snake story to make it seem like suicide. What we know is that Cleopatra chose death over submission. Whether it was a snake or poison or something else entirely, she made certain that Octavian would never drag her through the streets of Rome in chains. The most powerful woman in the world refused to let a Roman dictator have the final word. Her death was her last act of defiance. And even that got turned into a story that Rome could control. A dramatic snake tale that let them pretend she was exotic and strange to the end rather than simply brave. After Cleopatra died, Octavian went about systematically destroying everything she had built. Caesarion was hunted down and executed. Her son by Julius Caesar, the last threat to Octavian's claim as Caesar's heir, was strangled to death at 17. Cleopatra's other children, the three she had with Mark Antony, were taken to Rome and raised by Antony's Roman widow. They disappeared from history. We do not know what happened to Alexander Helios or Ptolemy Philadelphus. They were swallowed by Rome and never heard from again. Only Cleopatra Selene survived to adulthood, and she was married off to a client king in North Africa, where she could be controlled and forgotten. The bloodline that might have united Africa and Europe, that might have produced a dynasty of mixed heritage ruling the Mediterranean world, was systematically exterminated. Octavian understood that killing Cleopatra was not enough. He had to kill the possibility she represented. He had to make sure that no one would ever again imagine an African queen sitting on a throne that Rome considered its own. The children had to die or disappear because their existence proved that such a union was possible. And if it was possible once, it could be possible again. For a while after her death, Cleopatra's image retained some of its African features. Early artistic depictions, the ones made closest to her lifetime, show a woman with dark skin and curly hair. But as centuries passed and Europe developed its own obsession with racial hierarchy, Cleopatra got progressively whiter. Medieval European artists painted her as a pale noblewoman in European dress. Renaissance painters gave her flowing straight hair and delicate features. By the time the Enlightenment rolled around and Europeans were developing elaborate theories about racial superiority, Cleopatra had been fully transformed into a white woman who just happened to rule Egypt. Every generation made her a little more European. Every century moved her further from Africa. By the time Hollywood got a hold of her, the transformation was complete. Elizabeth Taylor in 1963. Monica Bellucci in a French film. Angelina Jolie was at one point rumored for a Cleopatra biopic. White woman after white woman after white woman cast as the Queen of Egypt, because the industry could not imagine an African woman being that important. They could not imagine audiences accepting a black Cleopatra. They could not imagine selling tickets to a movie where the most desirable woman in the ancient world did not look like a European beauty standard. The casting was not just wrong, it was political. It was a continuation of the same project Octavian started 2,000 years ago, erasing Cleopatra's African identity to protect a story about who matters and who does not. In 2023, Netflix released a documentary called Queen Cleopatra that depicted her as a black woman. The backlash was immediate and vicious. The Egyptian government filed complaints. Internet commenters lost their minds. Academic experts were trotted out to explain that actually Cleopatra was Greek and the documentary was spreading misinformation. Think about that for a second. A documentary suggests that an African queen of an African nation might have been black, and the response is international outrage. But centuries of paintings and movies showing her as white, totally fine. Nobody protests when Elizabeth Taylor plays Cleopatra. Nobody calls it misinformation when European actresses put on Egyptian costumes. The backlash only comes when someone suggests she might have looked like the continent she lived on. The intensity of the reaction tells you everything you need to know. They are not mad because the documentary was inaccurate. They are mad because it threatened the lie. They are mad because once you accept that Cleopatra might have been black, you have to start asking questions about every other thing they told you about who built civilization and who ruled empires and who contributed to human progress. The gatekeepers of history understand what is at stake. If they lose Cleopatra, they lose one of the most compelling figures in ancient history to African heritage, and they cannot afford to lose her because the mythology depends on keeping her white. This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern that repeats over and over throughout history. They take African knowledge and give credit to Europeans. They take African achievement and pretend it was Greek or Roman or anything but African. They take African people who changed the world and whitewash them until you would never know where they actually came from. I already told you about Onesimus, the enslaved man whose African knowledge of inoculation became the foundation for vaccines. They erased him and gave credit to Cotton Mather and Edward Jenner. Now I am telling you about Cleopatra, the African queen who almost conquered Rome. They erased her African identity and gave her European features and called her Greek. The same thing happened to the Moors who ruled Spain for 800 years and brought mathematics and astronomy and medicine to a European continent that was wallowing in the Dark Ages. They get called invaders and occupiers rather than the civilizers they actually were. The same thing happened to the Egyptians who built the pyramids and developed writing and created one of the first complex societies in human history. Somehow, they get separated from Africa in the European imagination, as if Egypt was not African, as if the people who lived there were not black. The pattern is always the same. Erase the African contribution. Give credit to Europeans. Maintain the myth that civilization is a white invention. And if anyone challenges the pattern, call them crazy or political or historically illiterate while you continue spreading lies that would make Octavian proud. Now let me tell you why this matters to you sitting there in 2024. This is not about ancient history. This is about today. The same lies they told about Cleopatra are the lies they still tell about Africa. The same erasure they practiced on her is the erasure they practice on you. Every time someone suggests that African civilizations were primitive or that black people have contributed nothing to human progress, they are echoing propaganda that started with Octavian and got repeated for 2,000 years until it felt like truth. But it is not truth. It never was truth. Africa had empires and queens and scholars and scientists while Europe was still living in mud huts. African knowledge saved Boston from smallpox. African mathematics made architecture possible. African philosophy influenced Greek thinkers who got credited with inventing everything. You come from civilizations that were old when Rome was young. You come from people who built pyramids and libraries and universities. You come from a tradition of queens who made emperors kneel and generals abandon their posts and empires tremble at the thought of African power. Cleopatra was not an exception. She was an example of what African leadership looked like when it had resources and opportunity. An example of what they are so afraid of that they spent 2,000 years trying to paint her white. When you know that, when you really internalize it, you start to see the world differently. You start to question every history lesson you ever received. You start to wonder what else they lied about. And that questioning is exactly what they have spent centuries trying to prevent. They told you Cleopatra was Greek. They told you she was white. They told you Egypt was somehow separate from Africa, that this African queen of this African nation was really European underneath. And you believed them because why would they lie about something like that? Now you know why. They lied because the truth was too dangerous. An African woman who spoke 9 languages, commanded armies, controlled the food supply of her enemies, seduced the 2 most powerful men in Rome, and came within a single battle of ruling the known world. That truth would crack the foundation of everything they built their supremacy on. So they buried it, they painted over it. They cast white actresses and wrote propaganda and shouted down anyone who questioned the fairy tale. But the truth does not care about their lies. The truth is stamped on coins with her face. The truth is carved in statues with her features. The truth is written in the terrified words of Romans who could not understand how an African queen had brought them so close to destruction. Her name was Cleopatra. She was African. And Rome feared her so much they spent 2,000 years trying to make sure you would never know it. Now you know. And if you think that is something, wait until I tell you about the African who was running the Roman Empire while everyone thought it was white. That story is going to break your brain.